and welcome to the September 5th Sunday service of the Unitarian Universalist Church of St. Petersburg, Florida. My name is Ben Atherton Zeman, and I'm the minister here. If you're new, the Unitarian Universalist congregation is a place for all souls, so all races, ages, genders, loves, colors, abilities, struggles, education, beliefs, questions, and hopes are welcome here. Our congregations are devoted to promoting spiritual growth and caring community, learning from all peoples and from our own life experiences. So whoever you are, wherever you are on your journey, you are welcome here. That's right, I mean you. If you're thinking, does he mean me? I do. A couple of things to note about viewing our services on YouTube. Closed captioning is available to provide accessibility. So on most devices and operating systems, you'll find the CC icon on the lower right portion of your screen. Lower right. If you're watching the YouTube premiere, then you can use the chat feature in the window next to the video. So go ahead and say hello right now if you haven't already. Let us know who you are, from where you are watching the YouTube live. Now, a reminder, we're going to gather outside the front of the church, socially distanced, to watch the worship service 2 Sundays from now, September 19th. If you're viewing today's service at a later time, you can still read the chat transcript by clicking on the Show Chat Replay button to the right of the video. Now, I hope that all of you watching will find something that helps you grow spiritually, both individually and as a member of our greater community. Your presence is needed and wanted as we work towards building a blessed community. I'm happy to be joined this morning by Susan Bernor, who will now light our chalice and read our covenant. But first, let us take a moment of silence to center ourselves for the worship.
Good morning. My name is Susan Bernor, and I'm a member of this church and really happy to be together with you this morning. The flaming chalice is a symbol of hope, the sacred, the quest for truth, the warmth of community, the light of reason, and more. We say our covenant along with the chalice lighting to create a reverent space for reflection, prayer, or meditation, and singing. Each week we say together this covenant from James Vila Blake from our hymnal. Please join me in saying it now as I light our chalice. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth and love, and to help one another.
What is critical race theory? Critical race theory is an interdisciplinary body of scholarship that emerged in the aftermath of the civil rights movement in the late 1970s. It does not define racism in the traditional manner as solely the consequence of discrete irrational acts perpetuated by individuals, but is usually the unintended but often foreseeable consequences of choices. It exposes the ways that racism is often cloaked in terminology regarding what we see on a regular basis, like mainstream media, or traditional values, neutral policies, principles, or practices. As quoted by Kimberly Crenshaw, CRT is not a thing, it is a way of looking at race. Now, recognition that race is not biologically real, but socially constructed and socially significant. It recognizes that science, as demonstrated in the Human Genome Project, dismisses the idea of biological racial differences. According to scholars, race is a byproduct of social involvement. It is a way of recognizing patterns of inequality. It is a way of looking at why, after so many centuries since emancipation, we have patterns of inequality that are enduring and stubborn. The point of CRT originally was to think, discuss how law contributed to the subordinate status of people of color. The point was to understand the problem and actually intervene in it. The greatest hopes in our republic were not realized, especially after it was encoded in law. It was inspired by the hopes of Frederick Douglass and Dr. Martin Luther King. It was created to help facilitate what the law did for free people, what is done for the slavers. It was created in the 70s to put about the task of understanding. Now, one of the most helpful features of CRT is clear analysis of white supremacy in the so-called post-civil rights era, a period in U.S. history when politicians and the majority population increasingly portrayed themselves as beyond race or non-racist. This is still an issue, and we're working every day to put language on it.
We have many things happening in our church community, so please be sure to check out the UU St. Pete Weekly for announcements. This is the time in our worship service for joys and concerns. And again, you have to imagine the candles I'm lighting or the rocks I'm putting into water. If you are watching this YouTube live, please type your joys and your concerns into the text chat. I light the first virtual candle for the people of Afghanistan, and especially for the women of Afghanistan. As a congregation, let us consider how we can help, especially those who are fleeing to the United States and need homes, jobs, and a community to welcome them. The second candle is for Beth Stombaugh, who is grateful that she had a successful surgery this week. We hope you continue to recover and heal, Beth. Next candle is for John Arterton, who is having atrial flutters and is investigating options. We'll keep you in our hearts, John. And then we light one final virtual candle for those joys and concerns that remain in our hearts, perhaps too tender yet to be spoken aloud. And let us take a moment of silence together. The mystery is that we are connected, even when we feel apart. So let us rejoice in our beloved community that makes of the many one. So may it be.
I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all these chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things I could say 'em loud, say 'em clear, for the whole world to hear. I wish I could share all the love in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep telling us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree everyone should be free. I wish I could be like a bird in the sky. How sweet it would be if I found I could fly. I'd soar to the sun and look down at the sea. Then I'd sing, 'cause I'd know how it feels to be free.
I talked with Reverend Ben about how to get into a potentially difficult topic, and he advised me to jump right in, so I will. This picture is of the front door of our beautiful building on Mirror Lake. It's a beloved place for all of us, and like many of you, I'm proud of its beauty and its history. But the no loitering sign on our front door is a little knife in my UU heart every time I see it. And it's not only because that sign is the opposite of what I think our front door should communicate: welcome, sanctuary, inclusiveness. It's also because loitering is a Jim Crow word. It's a code word along with vagrancy. Vagrancy and loitering laws were used after the Civil War to make it legal, for police to arrest people for doing nothing, just being out in public. They didn't have to be doing anything in particular. One law in Georgia made wandering or strolling about a crime. And those laws were used to continue the practice of slavery well into the 20th century. Especially men of color were arrested for simply existing. Unfortunately, I know what I'm talking about. Some of you know that my own family, like many other white families, has a sad history of participating in what is called slavery by another name, peonage. The arrest records from those days, up until America's entry into World War II, are clear. Sheriffs got requests for workers, deputies went out and rounded up people to charge with loitering, wealthy people paid the fines, and the loiterers became shackled workers, many dying without their families ever knowing what had happened to them. The records are meticulous and unabashed because people in charge at the time thought it was okay. We all know now, of course, that it was not okay. And I don't for a moment intend to imply that putting up a no loitering sign is an act of racism or oppression. Not at all. I understand why that sign was placed there, and I respect the people who made the decision to do so. The motivation was understandable. We as a congregation wanted to address the problem of having people hanging out on our front steps, leaving trash and worse behind. The police said they could not help us unless we had a sign posted, and we followed their advice. Maybe it was the best thing we could think of at the time, but the problem persists. And the message that word sends and the feelings it raises in me, I can hardly bear it. Imagine what it does to people whose families have been on the suffering side of that word's implications. I have to believe that there must be a better way, a solution that doesn't rely on the police to solve the problem, a solution that begins with conversation and compassion and a laser-sharp focus on our values. I shared these feelings with Reverend Ben, and he asked me to share them with you. I'm frankly nervous about doing so, but I'm honored to be part of today's service and committed to finding a better way. Thank you.
You're broken down and tired of living life on a merry-go-round, and you can find the fighter, but I see it in you, so we go walk it out. And mountains, gonna walk it out and move mountains. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day, I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid, I'll rise up, and I'll do it 1,000 times again. I'll rise up, I'll rise up, I'll rise up for you. You can have all the money in your head, all the possessions anyone could ever have, but it's all worth its treasure. True worth is only measured by what you got in your heart. You can have everything
Thank you, Susan, for the history and context of our church's no loitering sign. Thank you for letting us know the connection with slavery, the slave economy, segregation, and Jim Crow. Yet, there are some that would say the no loitering sign is not a vestige of Jim Crow. They would say that Jim Crow is a thing of the past. Maybe even racism itself is a thing of the past. They would say the sign simply allows our church to be safer, allows the police department more freedom to help us if we need them to. Which brings us to our question for the worship service. When it comes to historical, systemic, and modern day racism, whose voices do we listen to? Who gets to write the narrative? Critical race theory is being blamed for a great many things lately. Our education system is under attack because of critical race theory. Our democratic ideals are being eroded because of critical race theory. I stubbed my toe. Thanks, critical race theory. Responding to some of these attacks, our Unitarian Universalist Association shared a video on their Facebook page a few weeks ago. The video explained exactly what critical race theory was and what it was not. It featured an interview with Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the founders of critical race theory nearly 40 years ago. On the UUA Facebook page, most of the responses were positive. Many called attention to the importance of this work. One man called Dr. Crenshaw a brilliant intellectual leader and recommended her Intersectionality Matters podcast. But a few of the responses were not as positive. One said this sort of thing shames all white people for being white. Another lamented that Unitarian Universalism used to be a church to explore various religions, but it now seems to be the church of liberalism. Still another said it replaces racism with racism, adding that is why some folks are pushing back against such thinking. So, is critical race theory anti-white? Does it replace one kind of racism with another? And again, whose voices are privileged when speaking about the effects of racism in our denomination and in the wider culture? Who gets to write the narrative? Who will be believed and who will be attacked for their beliefs? September's theme through our worship services and religious education is embracing the possibilities. In keeping with our fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, let us seek to understand today and embrace the possibilities outlined in critical race theory. Let us try to understand what critical race theory is and what it is not. Dr. Crenshaw tells us that critical race theory originally focused on institutionalized racism as it was encoded in the laws of the United States. She says the theory inherits the beliefs of Frederick Douglass, of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who basically want the law to do for the freed people what the law did for enslavers. But even after the laws were changed, Crenshaw and others realized that the history of these laws had already shaped cultural norms and systems to benefit whites over people of color. And the current backlash against critical race theory is not unique. Dr. Crenshaw tells us there was a similar backlash at the end of the Civil War, when civil rights were framed as reverse discrimination against white people. And another backlash after Brown versus Board of Education, when integration was framed as damaging white children. Let me be clear. Critical race theory is not anti-white. This tried and true tactic of shooting the messenger frames racism as individual acts of overt prejudice by individual whites against individual people of color, which is not our denomination's understanding of racism. but it is a great silencing tactic. So if I call critical race theory anti-white, that means I don't have to listen to what Dr. Crenshaw has to say about the history of this country that I love. If I say critical race theory replaces one kind of racism with another, I can center my own feelings of discomfort rather than learning the history of Black Americans and other people of color. This history that has been kept from me by the forefathers of those who pass laws against the teaching of critical race theory today. Now, some of you are familiar with the New York Times' 1619 Project, which aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the United States national narrative. Nicole Hannah-Jones, the founder of the project, tells us that, quote, one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. By 1776, Hannah-Jones says, Britain had grown deeply conflicted over its role in the barbaric institution that had reshaped the Western Hemisphere. In London, there were growing calls to abolish the slave trade. This would have upended the economy of the colonies in both the North and the South. The wealth and prominence that allowed Thomas Jefferson at age 33 and other founding fathers to believe they could successfully break off from one of the mightiest empires in the world came from the dizzying profits generated by chattel slavery. In other words, Hannah-Jones says, we may never have revolted against Britain if the founders had not understood that slavery empowered them to do so, nor if they had not believed that independence was required in order to ensure that slavery would continue. It is not incidental that 10 of this nation's first 12 presidents were enslavers. Hannah-Jones concludes that some might argue that this nation was founded not as a democracy, but as a slaveocracy. Now, this is a hard possibility for me to embrace as a white person committing to ending racism. If I embrace this, it means that my personal wealth and any property my family accumulates does so partly benefiting from slavery and a slave economy. If I embrace Dr. Hannah-Jones's words, the songs I learned about this nation's ideals as a child, the songs about liberty and freedom, ring hollow in my memory. But according to Hannah-Jones and many others, the United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie. Hannah-Jones says, our Declaration of Independence, approved on July 4th, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal, but the white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of Black people in their midst. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness did not apply to fully 1/5 of the country. What does this mean for us as a religious denomination, as Unitarian Universalists? Even though today most of us do not identify as Christian, our denomination has a historical roots in progressive, but mostly white Christianity. And progressive white Christians have a history of largely remaining silent when it comes to challenging racism. Yes, many historical Unitarians and Universalists spoke out against slavery, but other Unitarians participated in the Fugitive Slave Act, turning in African Americans as suspected slaves when they were not. In his 1970 book, The Black Theology of Liberation, Dr. James Cone told us that American theology is racist, that it has failed miserably in relating its work to the oppressed in society by refusing to confront the structures of this nation with the evils of racism. How else, he asks, can we explain the theological silence during the period of white lynching of black humanity in this nation? Cone says that in a racist society, God is never colorblind. That American white theology is the theology of the Antichrist. And the movement for black liberation is the very work of God. Again, for me, as a white Unitarian Universalist, this makes me a little uncomfortable. And I can respond to my discomfort by getting defensive, by claiming color blindness. I can say, I don't even identify as white. I'm just a human being. But my fellow Unitarian Universalists, both whites and people of color, remind me that even if I don't want my white privilege, it's mine anyway. Even if I don't want to admit the United States was founded as a slaveocracy, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw and Nicole Hannah-Jones tell me it was. Even if I don't want to admit that Unitarianism and Universalism largely remain silent on issues of lynching and centered whiteness in their Christian worship, James Cone tells me that's what happened. So whose voice do I listen to? My own discomfort? Or Dr. Cone's visionary theology? Who gets to tell the story? And lest we think all racism exists only in the past, in recent years, in all years, courageous Unitarian Universalism religious professionals of color continue to tell us about the institutional and daily acts of racism they endure in our denomination. In 2017, several leaders responded to this by engaging the denomination in the white supremacy teach-in. Probably many of you here participated in the teach-in. And again, this made many white Unitarian Universalists uncomfortable. The notion that our denomination has a white supremacist culture was difficult to believe and is difficult to believe for those white UUs who helped build this denomination, especially those who helped build the denomination's progressive agenda. It's almost an axiom that the revolutionaries of today become the conservatives of tomorrow. But white UU minister Reverend Krista Tavez reminds us that we have been trained to see white supremacy as an overt expression of racism, replete with burning crosses, white hoods, Confederate flags, lynchings, and angry white people in black and white footage shouting racist epithets as black children try to enter white schools. This allows liberal whites to distance themselves from racism and believe that we aren't part of it. At least we aren't calling people names, threatening their lives, or muttering under our breath. White supremacy, Reverend Tavez says, is a way of thinking that devalues the experiences, insights, and lived reality of people of color. So I ask you again, who gets to write the narrative? Whose voices are privileged? Specifically, I ask my fellow white Unitarian Universalists, are we willing to believe people of color's lived experience when they tell us that they suffer racist indignities, racist attacks, racist microaggressions, and white supremacy in our own beloved denomination? Our first principle says that white UUs must believe UUs of color. If white UUs truly believe the inherent worth and dignity of every person, then a person of color's experience of reality must be believed. Our seventh principle says that white UUs must believe UUs of color. If we respect the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, then we need to take racism against UUs of color personally, not in a defensive and minimizing way, but in a way that makes white UUs just as outraged. Rather than outlawing the teaching of critical race theory, white UUs need to demand the learning that was denied us in school. We must be furious that our beloved denomination perpetrates the very same racism we purport to stand against. We must remember the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. This is the vision of King's beloved community that the UUA shares, that so many of our congregational leaders share, and that I share. And I hope you share it too. When a person of color tells me that racism is their daily lived experience, I believe them. Rather than becoming defensive, I choose to become curious, seeking more information. I choose to become enraged not at the messenger, but at the system that hurts my friend, that hurts my colleague, the system in which I have become complicit. But other white UUs are reacting differently. Reverend Krista Tavez asks, are there white people who will leave our churches over this? And admits, you bet. She advises us to accept their choice, that they will be held somewhere else. Are there people who will choose not to visit UU churches because of this difficult road we are walking? She answers, you bet. Not everyone is up to the task at hand. Unitarian Universalism was never for the faint of heart. And that is as true today as it has been throughout our history. But, she continues, if you want this journey into wholeness, if you want to live into the transformative community that doesn't shy away from calling truth to power, then Unitarian Universalism is for you. And I welcome you into this time, this place, and this faith. This is an incredible opportunity we have, and I want people like you sitting at the table of compassion and justice. Which possibilities do we embrace? Who gets to write the narrative? Whose voices are privileged? When speaking of race and racism, the lived experience of people of color should determine what we do as a church and as a denomination, even if it makes white UUs like me uncomfortable. So together, let us commit to centering the voices, leadership, and lived experience of the people of color in our midst. Together, let us build Dr. King's beloved community in this church, in the wider community, in the state of Florida, and in the world. You're up to the task at hand. I want you, yes, you. I want you sitting at the table of compassion and justice with me as we do this essential work together. Amen, and blessed be.
To keep our congregation thriving, let's remember our connection to one another and not forget our offerings to support those connections. As you listen to some beautiful music, to make a contribution, you can click on the I in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You can also donate either via the Give Plus app or our website under the Giving tab, or by sending a check to the church office. Thank you.
We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing for our lives. We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing for our lives.
And now, as our service ends, with a breath, we pass the flame of our chalice to each other as we say together, "We extinguish the flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of love, or the fire of courage. These we carry in our hearts and out into the world."